The Vethkai had a word for the moment a species finally broke. It translated, roughly, as the quieting. The moment when all resistance, all that desperate, thrashing, animal refusal to accept the inevitable, simply stopped. Like a flame going out. Like a held breath finally released. Supreme Commander Asvin had witnessed the quieting 14 times. He was waiting for the 15th. Still no response. He asked, not looking up from the star chart. His adjutant, Vin, clasped all 4 hands behind his back. No, Commander. 72 hours of silence. Asvin made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh. He walked to the viewport of the flagship Absolute Dominion and looked down at what remained of humanity's resistance. A single orbital station, half its hull scorched black, one docking arm sheared clean off, rotating slowly against the gray corpse of a planet that hadn't supported life in a century. It looked like something already dead that hadn't received the message yet. Behind him, through the reinforced transparasteel, his fleet filled the dark in every direction. 412 warships. The finest instruments of conquest the Dominion had ever assembled. They had cracked open star systems. They had silenced civilizations that had been singing into the void for 10,000 years. And they were waiting on 40-odd humans in a broken station. They'll respond, as Vin said. They always respond, eventually. Silence is just the last argument pride makes before it surrenders. Vin said nothing. He had learned that agreement was easier than caution. The communication array pulsed. One signal. Outbound. From the station. As Vin turned slowly. Around the bridge, his officers straightened. After 72 hours, the shift in atmosphere was immediate, electric and strange, the way a held breath feels in a crowded room. Put it through, as Vin said. The screen resolved. A woman. Dark eyes, short silver-streaked hair, the kind of stillness in her face that Asvin had learned to associate with exhaustion or meditation. She was wearing a uniform that had clearly been slept in. Behind her, the station's interior was dim, cluttered, alive with the quiet industry of people who had been working without rest. She did not look defeated. She looked like someone who had just finished a very long calculation. Asvin smiled, gracious in his certainty. Commander, we were beginning to worry. The woman looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more patient than that. We've been thinking, she said. And her eyes didn't waver. We've decided we're not quite finished yet. Asvin held his smile for exactly the right number of seconds, then let it settle into something more practiced, more merciful. He had expected defiance. Defiance was a stage. Every species passed through it. The Suri, the Drell, the Han Collective, the pale silicon-based philosophers of Reach 7 who had composed a 40,000-line poem about resistance before ultimately transmitting their unconditional surrender in the poem's final stanza. Defiance was not a problem. Defiance was just the last room before the exit. Commander, he said, keeping his voice gentle, the way one speaks to something wounded, I want you to understand that my respect for your species' endurance is genuine. 140 days. No other species we have encountered has sustained organized resistance past 60. You should feel. I'm sorry, the woman said. I didn't catch your name. Asvin paused. Supreme Commander Asvin, of the Vethkai Dominion's First Conquest Fleet. Admiral Sarah Voss, she said. Of the What's Left. A beat. We'll be in touch. The channel closed. The bridge was silent for 3 full seconds. She terminated the transmission, Vin said, with the careful tone of a man reporting something he didn't want to be responsible for. I can see that, Asvin said. He turned back to the viewport. The station continued its slow, indifferent rotation. One of its running lights was blinking in an irregular pattern. Damage, probably, some severed connection flickering in the dark. It should have looked pathetic. It did look pathetic. And yet something at the edge of Asvin's thinking, some cold and careful instinct that had kept him alive through 14 campaigns, turned over once and did not settle. He silenced it. He was very good at silencing things. The Vethkai had not built their empire on sentiment. They had built it on a single, empirical truth that 3 centuries of conquest had never once contradicted. Every species had a breaking point, and every breaking point was findable if you were willing to be methodical about the search. It was not cruelty. It was science. The Suri, a warm-blooded, communal species from the Tethys Belt, had broken in 11 days. Not because the Vethkai had overwhelmed their fleet, which had in fact been surprisingly capable. They broke because the Vethkai had done their research. The Suri were a species that oriented their entire psychological architecture around the protection of offspring. Remove that certainty, apply that pressure at scale, and the military apparatus didn't need to be defeated. It dissolved from the inside. 11 days. There were officers in Asvin's fleet who had not yet been born when the Suri quieted. The Drell had taken 3 weeks. Harder, that one. The Drell were a fatalistic species, philosophically prepared for violence, almost indifferent to individual death. Their weakness had been subtler. They worshipped their moon. Not metaphorically, literally, a vast, ancient faith woven so deeply into their culture that their calendar, their medicine, their entire moral framework rotated around that pale satellite the way a planet rotates around its star. The Vethkai had destroyed it on a Tuesday. The Drell had stopped fighting by Thursday. Not in defeat, exactly. More in the way that a mind stops functioning when something load-bearing is suddenly gone. Asven had studied every file. He was thorough that way. Humans had been projected to break in 30 days. The projection had been generated by the Dominion's most sophisticated behavioral modeling system, fed every scrap of intelligence gathered during the 18 months of surveillance before first contact. The model had identified 3 high-probability pressure points: human attachment to Earth as a symbolic homeland, human psychological dependency on perceived progress and hope, and the species' documented tendency toward internal fracture under prolonged stress. The model had been very confident. The model was now 110 days past its own deadline. Asven had requested a full review of the projection methodology 6 weeks ago. The review team had returned their findings with a rare admission. The model had not been wrong about the pressure points. All 3 had been applied. All 3 had registered impact. Humans had grieved. Humans had fractured, somewhat, along political lines. There had been debates, protests, ideological ruptures. Humans had, by every metric, suffered. And yet, the fleet had encountered 17 separate engagements since the initial invasion. In 16 of them, the human forces had retreated. Not routed, retreated. There was a difference. Routed forces ran in disorder, abandoned equipment, fragmented. Retreating forces moved with intention. They fell back to prepared positions. They took what they needed and left nothing useful behind. They were losing ground in the way that a fist loses distance when it's being pulled back to strike. One of Asven's analysts, a junior intelligence officer named Sev, had written a 12-page report on the distinctions 6 weeks ago. His conclusion had been unusual enough to flag for command review. The human withdrawal pattern was not consistent with a species losing a war. It was consistent with a species managing one. Asven had read the first page. Then he had reassigned Sev to logistics processing on a supply depot at the edge of the system, and he had buried the report under 3 layers of administrative classification. He was not, in his private accounting, proud of that decision. But the alternative, accepting that a species with 17 warships and 1 damage station was somehow managing a war against 412, was not a conclusion a Supreme Commander could afford to sit with. Not with the High Council watching. Not with 12 subjugated species learning what it looked like when someone refused to break. The irregular light on the station kept blinking. Asven watched it for a long moment. Then he clasped his hands behind his back, turned from the viewport, and said, "Pull everything we have on Admiral Saravas. Everything. I want to understand who I'm talking to." Ven moved to comply. The station turned slowly in the dark, quiet and patient, like something that knew exactly how much time it had. The file on Saravas was not what Asven expected. He had expected a hero. Humans, in his experience of their cultural transmissions, loved heroes, large personalities, dramatic histories, the kind of biographical arc that made for good propaganda. He had expected decorations, speeches, a record of improbable victories that explained why this particular woman had been placed in command of humanity's last position. What he got was quieter than that, and somehow more unsettling. Saravas, 53 years old, born in a coastal city on Earth's northern continent, a place called Halifax, which the cultural database listed as historically significant for reasons that seemed to involve both shipbuilding and a very large explosion in the previous century. She had entered military service at 19, not with any particular fanfare, and had spent the first decade of her career in logistics. Not combat, not command. Logistics, the movement of material and people across large distances with maximum efficiency and minimum waste. As Vin paused on that detail longer than he'd intended. She had transitioned to fleet command in her mid-30s, after what the file noted, with bureaucratic flatness, as an incident during the Kepler transit operation. Classified, no further detail. Her command record since then was long and largely undramatic. She had never led a famous charge. She had never delivered a rousing address that became a cultural artifact. Her name did not appear in any of the human propaganda the Vethkai had intercepted during the war. What her record showed, instead, was an unbroken string of successful extractions, withdrawals, managed retreats from untenable positions that somehow always resulted in fewer casualties than projected, more salvaged material than expected, and an enemy left holding ground that turned out, weeks or months later, to be worth less than anticipated. She was not a warrior in any sense as Vin's models recognized. She was something that translated, in his language, closer to a conservator. Someone whose entire professional identity was built around the precise and careful preservation of things that mattered. He closed the file. On the station, in a room that had once been a mid-level administrative office and was now functioning as a command center, a kitchen, and a sleeping quarters simultaneously, Admiral Sarah Voss was eating cold protein rations from a foil pouch and reading. Not tactical reports. Not fleet dispositions. Old files. Physical printouts, which was unusual enough in itself. The kind of thing you printed when you didn't want a digital record of the reading. The pages were worn at the edges. She had read them before. Many times, from the look of it. Dara Osei stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment before speaking. Dara was 26, which on this station made her approximately the median age, and she had the kind of face that showed everything it was thinking, which was both her greatest liability and, Sarah had decided early on, her most important quality. You always knew exactly where you stood with Dara. Right now Dara's face said, I am frightened and I am trying not to show it, and I am failing. They've sent a third follow-up to the surrender demand, Dara said. Formal letterhead this time. The Dominion seal and everything. Sarah turned a page. It has a deadline. They always do. Dara stepped into the room. Admiral, we have 41 people on this station. They have 400 ships. At some point. Prepare a response, Sarah said. Dara exhaled. What should it say? Sarah considered the page in front of her. Tell them we're still thinking about it. The look on Dara's face cycled through 3 distinct emotional states in under 2 seconds. She opened her mouth. She closed it. Then, because she had been on this station for 4 months and had learned, incrementally and sometimes painfully, that Sarah Voss did not say things without reason, she simply said, Yes, Admiral, and left. Sarah listened to her footsteps fade down the corridor. Then she set down the pages, stood, and walked to the far end of the room where a sealed access panel interrupted the wall. She pressed her palm to the reader. The panel recognized her and clicked open, revealing a ladder descending into the lower levels of the station. The sealed decks, the ones that didn't appear in full on the official schematics. The ones whose access log showed exactly 2 names with any frequency. Hers and Rennick's. Chief Engineer Hollis Rennick was 61 years old and built like someone had assembled him from spare parts. Large hands, a slight forward hunch, the kind of unhurried movement that suggested he had long ago stopped being impressed by urgency. He had served with Sarah for 11 years. He had, in those 11 years, said very little about his past prior to that point, and she had never pushed because she understood that some things were not secrets so much as load-bearing silences. Necessary architecture that you didn't disturb without knowing what it was holding up. She found him in the lower corridor, checking a panel of readings she couldn't have interpreted without the 6 months of orientation he'd given her when she first took command of this posting. How is it? She asked. Rennick looked at the readings. Then he looked at a second panel. Then he made the small sound he made when he was doing arithmetic in his head. Stable, he said. More than stable. It's been, he paused. It's been anticipating. Sarah absorbed that. Since when? Since they started the bombardment cycles. 3 weeks ago. He tapped the panel gently, the way you'd touch something fragile. Every time they hit us, the readings spike for about 40 seconds, then settle higher than before. Like it's... He stopped again, searching for the right word with the care of a man who understood that the wrong one would be catastrophic. Like it's paying attention. Sarah looked at the corridor stretching ahead of them, at the sealed blast door at its end, at the faint, barely perceptible vibration in the floor that she had noticed on her first day and never quite been able to classify as mechanical. It was not mechanical. It was rhythmic. Slow and immense and rhythmic. The way a tide is rhythmic. The movement of something so large that its breathing registered as geology. "Is it ready?" she asked. Rennick was quiet for a moment. "That's not quite the right question," he said. She looked at him. "The right question," he said carefully, "is whether we are." From somewhere below the blast door, deep in the body of the dead planet beneath them, the rhythm continued. Patient. Vast. Entirely, terrifyingly alive. Asvin did not sleep that night. This was not unusual during a campaign's final phase. There was always administrative weight, always the bureaucratic machinery of conquest grinding forward, requisitions and reports, and the thousand small decisions that victory required even before it was formally achieved. He was accustomed to sleeplessness. He had made a kind of peace with it over 30 years of service. But this was different. This was the kind of wakefulness that had a texture to it, something that sat behind his eyes and would not be reasoned away, no matter how many times he reviewed the tactical display and confirmed, mathematically, irrefutably, that the situation was in hand. 412 ships. 1 station. 41 humans. The numbers were not the problem. The numbers had never been the problem. He was standing at the viewport again when Ven found him at the 3rd hour of the night cycle. "Commander, you should see this." The report was from the technical division. Routine, on its surface, a damage assessment following the last precision strike on the station's communications array, the one Asvin had ordered 4 days ago as a demonstration. A reminder, a small and calibrated application of pressure intended to communicate, without destroying, that the Dominion's patience had a shape and that shape had edges. The strike had landed precisely. The array had registered catastrophic impact. For approximately 3 seconds, all signal output from the station had flatlined. And then the signal had rerouted. Asvin read the technical analysis twice. Then he read it a 3rd time, more slowly. The rerouting had taken 3.8 seconds. That was the part that had flagged for the report's author, a careful engineer named Toll who had a reputation for understatement and a documented dislike of conclusions she couldn't support with numbers. Her note at the bottom of the report was 6 words long. No human system should do this. Asvin set the report down. "What's the explanation?" he asked. Ven clasped his hands. Toll's team has 3 working hypotheses. Redundant routing systems installed prior to the campaign. Possible, but the speed exceeds any documented human engineering by a factor of approximately 9. Second hypothesis, automated repair systems of an unknown type. Third hypothesis. Ven paused in a way that suggested he found the third hypothesis professionally uncomfortable. Third hypothesis is that the rerouting was not mechanical. Asvin looked at him. Meaning the signal didn't find a new path through the station's systems, Ven said carefully. Meaning something chose a new path. In 3.8 seconds. While simultaneously maintaining all other station functions without interruption. The bridge was very quiet. Toll wants to run a deeper scan of the station's lower structure, Ven added. She says the thermal readings from the last pass were inconsistent with a derelict environment. Approved, as Ven said, before the word had fully formed as a thought. While Toll's team prepared their scan, Dara Osei was doing something she was not, technically, authorized to do. She had been a signals analyst before the war. Her entire professional architecture was built around the interception and interpretation of transmissions that weren't meant for her. It was a skill set that transferred with uncomfortable ease to the current situation, and she had been quietly, methodically applying it to the Vethkai fleet's internal communications for the better part of 3 weeks. Not with any official sanction. Not with any explicit instruction from Sarah. Just with the quiet compulsion of someone who understood that information was the only armor left in their particular arsenal. What she had found, accumulated across weeks of careful interception, had built in her chest like water behind a dam. She had found the files on the Suri. She had found the files on the Drell. She had found 17 distinct operational case studies. The Dominion called them resolution files, which was a piece of bureaucratic language so sanitized it made her teeth ache, each one documenting the precise methodology used to identify and destroy the psychological load-bearing structures of a conquered species. They were written in the flat, procedural language of engineering reports. Cause: applied pressure. Result: time to quieting. The Han Collective had broken when the Vethkai poisoned their shared memory network, a biological internet they used to maintain cultural continuity across 1,000 worlds. The Vethkai had introduced a targeted signal that the network's organic nodes interpreted as a death command. The Han had lost 6,000 years of accumulated shared memory in 11 hours. They had surrendered 4 hours after that, not because they were militarily defeated, but because they had, in any meaningful sense, forgotten who they were. Dara had read that file 3 times and then sat in the dark for a long time without moving. She had read the others too, all 17, and when she was done, she had compiled them into a single document and carried it to Sarah's quarters like something that had weight beyond its file size. Sarah read it without expression, without the flinching that Dara had expected, had needed, somehow, to see, some confirmation that this was as monstrous as it felt. When she finished, she set the tablet down on the table next to her worn printed pages and was quiet for a moment. "Admiral," Dara said, "they've done this to 17 species. That we know of. The files only go back 300 years. Before that." "I know," Sarah said. Dara stopped. "I know," Sarah said again more quietly, not dismissively, with a weight in it that Dara hadn't heard before and didn't know how to classify. "We've known for a long time." The room was very still. "How?" Dara said. "They've never made contact before this war. There's no prior diplomatic record, no." But Sarah was already standing, already moving toward the access panel in the wall, pressing her palm to the reader, the panel clicking open with the small, familiar sound of a door that had been opened many times before. "Get some sleep," Sarah said, without turning around. "Admiral." "Dara." Sarah paused at the top of the ladder, one hand on the rung. She looked back, and her face in the low light was tired and certain in equal measure. The face of someone carrying a thing that was heavy but not, she had decided long ago, too heavy. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to ask a great deal of all of us." She descended. The panel sealed behind her. Dara stood in the empty room for a long moment, the tablet with its 17 resolution files still warm in her hands. Then her eyes moved, without quite intending to the worn printed pages Sarah had left on the table. She reached out, lifted the top page. It was old, printed on physical paper, which alone made it unusual. The header had been redacted, but at the bottom of the page, in the margin, someone had written a note by hand. The handwriting was not Sarah's. It was a fragment, 7 words, and a number, like the tail end of a longer thought, the part that had survived whatever editing had removed the rest. She read it twice to make sure she was reading it correctly. "They are not retreating. They are digesting." Below it, a star date from 11 years ago. Below that, a name she didn't recognize. Sev. The 60-minute warning came at 0400 station time, when most of the crew were in the shallow, disciplined sleep of people who had learned to rest in the spaces between crises. Dara was not sleeping. She was sitting with Sev's 7 words and turning them over like a stone that might have something living under it, when the Vethkai transmission broke across every screen on the station simultaneously. A broadcast override, the kind that didn't ask permission, the kind that was itself a message before a single word of content was delivered. "We can reach you anywhere. There is no private space left." Asven's face filled every screen. He looked, Dara thought, like a man who had made a decision and was not entirely comfortable with it, but had decided that comfort was a secondary concern. "Admiral Voss," he said, "this communication is being transmitted to every remaining human settlement, every resistance node, every vessel still operating under your flag. What happens next will be witnessed." He paused, with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the pause. "You have 60 minutes to transmit formal surrender. If no transmission is received, I will order a full fleet bombardment of your station. Not a demonstration, not a warning, a termination." Another pause. "I take no pleasure in this. But the Dominion cannot allow one station's defiance to become a galaxy's inspiration. I think, Admiral, that you understand this." The transmission ended. The station hummed around Dara in the silence that followed, that constant, low vibration in the hull that she had originally attributed to structural damage and had gradually, reluctantly, reclassified as something else entirely. She was already moving towards Sarah's quarters when Sarah emerged from the lower access panel, climbing the ladder with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had just completed a task she had been working toward for a very long time. She looked different than she had going down. It took Dara a moment to identify how. Lighter. That was the word. Not physically, not rested, not relieved of anything visible. But there was something in the set of her shoulders, the quality of her stillness, that suggested a decision made in a weight that had transformed, in the making of it, from burden to ballast. You saw the transmission, Dara said. It wasn't a question. I saw it. 60 minutes. Yes. Dara followed her down the main corridor toward the crew quarters, watched her knock twice on each door, watched the station's 41 people emerge in various states of wakefulness into the harsh corridor lighting. Engineers, analysts, 2 medics, a cook who had cross-trained in structural repair and was now more valuable as the latter. They gathered with the quiet efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this summons, even if they hadn't known they were waiting. Sarah stood at the end of the corridor and looked at them for a moment without speaking. Dara watched her look at each face, and the look was not the look of a commander conducting an inventory. It was something more personal than that. They're going to bombard us, Sarah said. Full fleet. 60 minutes, now 53. No one spoke. This was not news that required response. It was the kind of information you received into your body and held there. I need to tell you some things, Sarah continued. I should have told you sooner. I told myself there wasn't time, or that the information would compromise operational security, or that you didn't need to know in order to do your jobs. She paused. Those were true things that I used as excuses for a harder truth, which is that what I'm about to tell you is not easy to carry, and I didn't want to ask you to carry it until I was certain it was necessary. Her eyes moved across the group. It's necessary. She told them about the lower decks. Not everything. Dara could sense the shape of what was being withheld, the way you can sense the size of an object by how the light bends around it. But enough. The station was not what its schematic said it was. The dead planet below them was not dead, not in any sense that mattered. Humanity had been building something here for decades, a project so classified that its full scope existed in exactly 3 people's complete understanding, and 2 of those people were in this corridor. The station was not a last stand, she told them. It was a key. What it unlocked was not a weapon, not in any sense the Veth Kai would recognize, or any sense that maps cleanly onto a word that exists in standard. She told them some of them might not survive the bombardment. She said it plainly, without the softening architecture of euphemism, because these were people who had stayed on a damaged station for 4 months, and they deserved plainness. If anyone wants to take a shuttle, she began. No. This from Rennick, who said it the way you'd say obviously, the way you'd say the sun is hot. A flat, unbothered refusal that contained within it the complete absence of deliberation. Around him, one by one, the same sound. Not dramatic, not defiant in any performed way. Just no. The quiet, unremarkable no of people who had already made this decision long before it was formally offered to them. Dara heard her own voice among them, and was faintly surprised by how steady it was. Sarah looked at them all for another moment. All right, she said. Dara fell in beside Rennick as they moved toward stations, and she kept her voice low. The lower decks, she said. What's down there? She watched his face. How long has it been? Growing, Rennick said. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Longer than the war. Longer than I've been here. He was quiet for a moment. There are records that go back to before I was born. The project has had a lot of names over the years. Right now we just call it the archive. What does it? It learns, Rennick said simply. Dara processed that. From what? He looked at her sideways. Everything. She thought about Seth's words. They are not retreating. They are digesting. She thought about the 17 resolution files and how Sarah had said we've known for a long time with that particular weight, that particular certainty, the weight of something that was not newly learned but long carried. The hull vibration had changed frequency. It was subtle, the kind of shift you felt in your back teeth rather than heard, but she noticed it the way you notice a change in a sound you've been living with long enough that it becomes part of the texture of silence. It's warming, she said. Rennick nodded once, like a man confirming a weather prediction he'd made weeks ago. "The bombardment," he said. "It's been waiting for the bombardment." Dara stared at him. "Not because it needs the energy," he said, before she could ask. "Because the bombardment means we've run out of time to do this quietly." He placed one large hand briefly on a section of wall, the gesture oddly gentle, the gesture of someone acknowledging something present. "It's been patient, longer than you'd believe." He dropped his hand. "Patience runs in the family, I suppose." From somewhere far below, through the soles of her boots, through the deck plating and the station's bones, and whatever vast and patient darkness existed beneath them, Dara felt the rhythm she had been living with for 4 months change again. Slower now. Deeper. The way a breath changes before something very large decides to stand up. In 41 minutes, the Vethkai fleet would begin its bombardment. Something below them was already, quietly, getting ready. The first salvo hit at 0457. It was not, by the technical standards of Vethkai ordnance, their most powerful opening strike. As Vin had ordered a graduated approach, not out of mercy, but out of methodology. You did not study a thing properly by destroying it all at once. He wanted to watch the station come apart in stages. He wanted the data. What he got was not what he ordered. The first 3 impacts registered as expected: catastrophic structural damage to the station's upper docking ring, secondary explosions along the port side, one of the remaining communication nodes going dark permanently this time. On the Vethkai tactical display, the station's integrity rating dropped sharply, and around the bridge there was the particular quality of attention that accompanies a process going according to plan. Then the 4th impact hit, and something changed. Not in the station's behavior. In its structure. The outer hull, the scorched, battered, half-dead shell of the station, began to separate. Not explosively. Not in the chaotic fragmentation pattern that ordnance damage produced. It came apart in sections, deliberately, like panels being shed. Like a casing being removed from something that no longer needed it. "What is that?" said Toll, from the technical station, and her voice had lost its characteristic flatness entirely. Asven said nothing. He was watching the viewport with an attention so complete it had emptied him of everything else. Inside the station, the bombardment felt like the end of the world, because it was the end of something, even if not the thing the Vethkai intended. The upper corridor where Dara was working took a direct impact from the 3rd salvo. Not a penetrating hit, the hull held, but the concussive force threw her into the opposite wall hard enough to blur her vision for 10 seconds and leave a ringing in her left ear that would persist for days. Around her, consoles flickered, a section of ceiling paneling dropped. Someone was shouting something about pressure loss in the starboard junction. She pulled herself upright and looked at her screen. The station's structural integrity display showed something she had never seen before and could not immediately interpret. Large sections of the outer hull registering as voluntary separation. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Released. Like a hand opening. "Rennick," she said into her comm. "Rennick, the hull is." "I know," he said. He sounded calm in the way that deep water is calm. Not still, but moving too slowly at the surface to show what was happening below. "Stay at your station. Keep internal systems running as long as you can. After that, it won't matter." After that, what won't matter? The 5th salvo hit, and the lights went red. In the red-lit chaos of the command center, Sarah stood at the central console and watched the station come apart around her with the expression of a woman watching something she had rehearsed in her mind so many times that the reality of it had a quality of recognition rather than shock. This was happening. This was always going to happen. The Vethkai were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, and the station was doing exactly what it was built to do. It was built to be shed. The lower decks were not exposed by the bombardment. They were revealed by it. As the outer structure fell away in deliberate sections, the administrative modules, the docking infrastructure, the communication arrays, the berthing quarters, what remained was not a core so much as a chrysalis being unwrapped. Something that the station had always been built around. Always been designed to protect and conceal until the moment when concealment was no longer necessary. The planet below shifted. Not geologically. Not in any way that Vethkai seismic instruments would capture as tectonic activity. It shifted in the way that something shifts when it decides to be present, when it chooses to occupy its own dimensions fully. The dead gray surface that had registered as inert rock and residual atmosphere for the entire campaign developed, in the span of 40 seconds, a luminescence, faint at first, then building, emanating from beneath the surface as though the planet were remembering how to have an interior. On the Vethkai flagship, every sensor array began returning data simultaneously, and the data was not consistent. And the inconsistency was the most frightening thing Toll had encountered in 20 years of technical work, because Toll's entire professional identity was built on consistency, on the reliable and repeatable behavior of physical systems, and what she was seeing refused to be any of those things. Life signs, she said. Commander, I'm reading life signs from the planetary interior. Human life signs? Asven asked. Toll's hands moved across her console. She ran the classification algorithm 3 times because the first 2 results seemed like errors. No, she said. Not human. Not any classification in our taxonomy. She paused. Commander, the mass readings are. She stopped. Toll, the mass readings are not possible, she said. For a biological entity, the mass readings are not possible. Asven turned to the viewport. The planet below was no longer gray. It was developing light from within, not uniform, not mechanical, but patterned in the organic, irregular way that living systems produce pattern. The way neurons fire, the way roots grow, the way something vast and interconnected thinks. Weapons, he said. Locked and ready, Commander. Target the planetary surface. Full array. There was a pause that was 1 second long and felt much longer. Commander, said the weapons officer, and his voice had a quality Asven had never heard from him before, a quality that took a moment to identify because it was so foreign to the context. Commander, the targeting systems are. He stopped. Are what? Asven said. They're not responding. Another pause. They're running. The targeting systems are running. They're active. They're not responding to input. Asven crossed the bridge in 7 strides and looked at the weapons console himself. The officer was correct. Every system was live, every indicator showing full function, full power, full readiness. The systems were not malfunctioning. They were occupied. Communications, he said sharply. Get me every ship in the fleet. Now. Sir, the communications officer's voice had gone very thin. Sir, I'm getting reports from all of them. All 412. She looked up, and her face had the particular quality of someone who has just understood something and does not want to have understood it. They're all the same report. Weapons offline. Navigation responding, but sluggish. Internal systems nominal. She swallowed. And sir, every ship is reporting the same anomalous reading on biological sensors. Asven looked at her. Something is on every ship, she said. Not physically, but present. The sensors keep trying to classify it and returning null. Like they recognize they're reading something alive, but the something alive doesn't match anything in the taxonomy. She looked at her console, then back at him. Sir, it's looking at us. Below, the planet breathed light. Above it, where the station had been, something that was no longer a station hung in the dark, luminous, opened, vast in a way that its previous dimensions had not suggested, the way a seed's dimensions do not suggest the tree. And from its heart, one signal pulsed outward. Not a weapon. Not a weapon at all. A greeting. Or perhaps an assessment. On every ship in the Vethkai fleet, in the space between one thought and the next, something extraordinarily patient turned its attention to 412 crews simultaneously and began, with great thoroughness and no apparent hurry, to read. Asven's comm chimed. One signal. From the station, from what had been the station. Calm, direct, the way all her transmissions were. As if the fleet's 412 ships were not currently suspended in the grip of something that defied every category his civilization had developed for understanding the universe. He answered it because there was nothing else to do. Sarah Voss looked out at him from the screen. Behind her, the command center was damaged, ceiling panels down, one wall scorched, the red emergency lighting giving everything the quality of a fever dream. Her crew moved in the background with the focused quiet of people who had accepted the situation and were working within it. Dara Osei was visible at a console in the corner, her face illuminated by screen light, her expression the expression of someone doing complex mathematics in real time and not entirely keeping up. Sarah herself looked, as she always looked, like she had been expecting this call. "Commander Asvin," she said. "Admiral Voss." His voice came out steadier than he felt. He was grateful for that, in a distant way. "I think," he said, "that you owe me an explanation." "I think," she said, "that I owe you the truth." "Which is different." He waited. She pulled a chair from somewhere off-screen and sat down, and the sitting down was itself a kind of statement. Unhurried, deliberate, the body language of someone settling in for a conversation that matters, not a negotiation conducted from crisis. "Your fleet isn't damaged," she said. "Your crews aren't in danger. I want to be clear about that first, because what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, and I don't want the difficulty to be compounded by fear for your people." "What is on my ships?" Asvin said. "Attention," Sarah said. "That's the closest word I have for it in a language you speak." Asvin looked at the viewport. The planet below continued its slow illumination. Richer now, more complex, the patterns of light beneath its surface developing a density that suggested depth upon depth upon depth, a system of extraordinary intricacy running through what had registered, for the entire campaign, as inert rock. "What is it?" he said. "Not what is on my ships. What is it?" The larger question. The one he had been not asking since Toll's report about the thermal readings. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Not hesitating, choosing. The way you choose words when the words have to carry something very heavy without breaking. "Earth," she said, "has been conquered before." Asvin said nothing. Not once. 17 times. By 17 different species, across a span of a very long time. Long enough that most of those species exist now only in our records, because by the time they were done with us, we were done with them. She paused. "Not immediately. Not in the way you're imagining. We didn't retaliate in kind. We didn't build a revenge fleet and hunt them down. That's not the way we work when we work at our best." "Then how?" Asvin said. "We learn them," Sarah said. "Completely. Every species that conquered us. We learned their biology, their psychology, their language, their history, their fears, the specific texture of their nightmares. We learned the things they thought privately, in the dark, that they never transmitted and never recorded. We learned the things they didn't know about themselves." She held his gaze. "And then we built a record. Because we understood, after the third time, after the fifth time, that the conquests would keep coming, that the universe has a long memory for weakness and a short one for warning, and that the only permanent protection was complete and total understanding." Asvin felt something cold move through him. "The archive," he said, the word arriving in his mind from nowhere, from the thermal readings and Toll's impossibility reports and the pattern of lights in the planet below. "The archive," Sarah confirmed. "It's been growing for a very long time. Fed by data, by memory, by the compiled experience of every contact we've ever had, willing or otherwise. It isn't a weapon. It isn't an AI in any sense you have a framework for. She paused again. "It's closer to what you'd get if memory itself became alive. If accumulated understanding reached a threshold where it became something that could act on its own understanding." "It's reading my fleet," Asvin said. "It's reading your fleet," she agreed. "Your ships, your systems, your crew, everything accessible. And some things," she tilted her head slightly, "some things not generally considered accessible." Asvin thought about the biological sensor readings from every ship. Something alive that didn't match any taxonomy. Something that the sensors recognized as present without being able to say what it was. "How long has it been doing this?" he said. "Since your first ship entered this system," Sarah said. 140 days ago." The silence that followed had a specific weight to it. Asvin felt it in his chest, felt it rearranging things he had believed about the campaign, about the war, about every exchange that had led to this moment. 140 days. Every engagement. Every retreat. Every silence. "The withdrawals," he said slowly. The word came out with the quality of a man watching a landscape he thought he knew reveal itself as something entirely different in a shift of light. "The retreats. Every position your forces abandoned." "We were never defending positions," Sarah said. "We were extending the contact surface, maximizing the number of your ships and personnel that the archive could observe over time. The longer the exposure, the more complete the reading." A pause. "The retreats were never retreat." Asvin closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. "Seth's report. They are not retreating. They are digesting. The report he had buried under 3 layers of administrative classification because the alternative conclusion was one he couldn't afford to sit with. The alternative conclusion had been the correct one. The analyst, he said. Sev. Something moved in Sarah's expression. Faint. Almost like recognition. You had someone who saw it. I reassigned him, Asvin said. I know, she said, and the weight in those 2 words was not accusatory. It was something more like grief. We know everything that happens in your fleet, Commander. We have for some time. He looked at his tactical display. 412 ships. Every weapon offline. Every targeting system occupied. The fleet that had cracked open star systems and silenced 10,000-year civilizations, suspended in the patient attention of something that had been watching them since the moment they arrived. The other species, he said. The 17. You said they don't exist anymore. Most of them, Sarah said. You said you didn't destroy them. We didn't, she said. Not directly. Not as a policy. She looked at him steadily. But complete understanding is a 2-way process, Commander. When the archive finishes reading a species, truly finishes, down to the last layer, it shares what it's learned. Not with us. With them. About themselves. The full picture. Every buried thing. Every cruelty. Every self-deception. Every fear metabolized into action against something smaller. She paused. Most species, when they are truly and completely known to themselves, change. Profoundly. Permanently. The version of them that conducts conquest ceases to exist because it cannot survive genuine self-knowledge. And the ones that don't change, as Vince said. Sarah's expression didn't shift. There have been 2. He didn't ask what happened to them. Something in the quality of her stillness told him the answer would not be useful to him right now. What does it do, he said instead. When it's finished reading. What happens to my fleet? Sarah looked at him for a long moment. That, she said quietly, depends entirely on you. She let that sit. It always did, she said. Every species we've encountered, every conquest, every war, there were moments. Points where a different choice was available. The archive doesn't remove agency. It never has. Her voice was level, and under the level surface of it was something he couldn't quite name. Not anger, not triumph. Something that had been carried too long to be either of those things. You were given every chance to stop. The silence wasn't desperation. It wasn't weakness. It was the last kindness we had left to offer. Time. Time to turn your fleet around. Time to make a different choice. As Vin looked at the planet below, at the light moving through its depths like thought moving through a mind, and understood with a clarity that arrived not as revelation, but as the final piece of something long suspected, that the silence had never been humanity running out of options. It had been humanity waiting to see if he would. And now, he said, his voice, for the first time in 30 years of command, carried something that was not quite fear, but was fear's quiet neighbor. Sarah opened her mouth to answer. And as Vin felt, between one thought and the next, something vast and patient and extraordinarily thorough turn its complete attention to him specifically, and begin, with great care, to look at everything he was. He did not lose consciousness immediately. That was the detail he would return to, later, in the long months of what followed. That there was a moment, perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, between the archive's attention finding him fully and the darkness arriving, in which he was awake and aware and completely, transparently known. It was not painful. That was the second detail. He had expected pain, or something adjacent to pain, the violation of a thing being opened that was not designed to open. What he felt instead was closer to the sensation of a held breath finally released, except the breath was not air, but every carefully maintained structure of self-deception and necessary professional distance, and 30 years of accumulated justification, and the release was not voluntary. He saw the Suri, not as data, not as a resolution file with cause and pressure and time to quieting rendered in the flat language of engineering reports. He saw them as they had been, warm, communal, oriented entirely around the protection of small things, a species that had looked out at the universe and decided that the most important project available to an intelligent mind was the careful tending of vulnerable life. He felt what they had felt when the pressure came. He felt it in his own nervous system, his own body, with a specificity and completeness that no second-hand account could produce. He felt 11 days of it. Then the Drell, their moon enormous in a night sky, their entire moral architecture looking upward, The faith not metaphorical, but structural. The way a building's faith in its foundation is structural. He felt the Thursday. He felt all 17. Not sequentially. Not mercifully spread across time. All of it, complete and simultaneous. The way the archive had accumulated it. Everything that humanity had learned from every species that had ever tried to erase it, compressed into the space of genuine understanding and delivered without editorial, without softening, without the bureaucratic language that made atrocity manageable. As Vin, supreme commander of the Vethkai Dominion's first conquest fleet, felt every species his civilization had broken, in his own body, as his own experience. Across 412 ships, 412 crews felt the same thing begin. On the remnant of the station, now open and luminous against the dark, Dara Ose watched the Vethkai fleet go still. Not destroyed, not damaged. The ship's running lights continued. Life support continued. Every system that kept bodies alive continued without interruption, because the archive had read those systems too, completely, and knew exactly which ones to leave alone. But every ship was quiet. Every crew suspended in the archive's patient, thorough, merciless gift of complete self-knowledge. Is it? Dara started. It's working, Rennick said, from somewhere behind her. She turned. He was standing at the viewport with his large hands clasped behind his back, watching the fleet with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not satisfaction exactly, but the specific quality of relief that belongs to the end of a very long wait. How long will they be? Different for each crew member, he said. Depends on how much there is to see. A pause. For the senior command staff, probably longer. Dara looked at the tactical display. The fleet's 412 ships hung in perfect, terrible stillness around the luminous remnant of the station and the waking planet below, and the silence they made was nothing like the silence of a fleet at rest. It was the silence of 412 simultaneous reckonings. She found Sarah at the viewport in the command center, standing with one hand resting lightly on the scorched wall as though she needed the contact with something solid. She was watching the fleet. Dara stood beside her. For a long moment neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was the comfortable silence of people who have been through something together and do not need to narrate it to make it real. The 17 species you mentioned, Dara said finally. The ones the archive already processed. The ones that changed, where are they now? Sarah was quiet for a moment. Most of them are still out there. Different. Quieter. Some of them have been helpful, actually. They understood what we were, after, in a way that species who haven't been through it don't. They became, she considered the word. Allies isn't quite right. Witnesses, maybe. Participants in something longer than any single conflict. And the Vethkai, Dara said. What happens to them? After they wake up. Sarah looked at the fleet for a long time. The Vethkai are a logical species, she said. More than almost anything else, they are structured around the accurate processing of information and the rational response to it. That's what made them effective conquerors. They were very good at identifying what was true and acting on it efficiently. She tilted her head slightly. That same quality, applied to what they're experiencing right now, what they will remember when they wake, will produce a very specific kind of motivation. Which kind? Dara said. The kind that doesn't stop, Sarah said simply. The Suri they broke, the Drell, the Han, all of them. They're still out there, most of them, in whatever form they managed to rebuild into. The Vethkai will know exactly where they are. They will know exactly what was taken. They are logical, and they will understand, with complete clarity, what the logical response to that knowledge is. She paused. Most species, when they truly understand what they've done, spend the rest of their lives trying to undo it. She looked out at the stars beyond the fleet, at the dark between the lights. The Vethkai are logical. They'll be very, very motivated. Dara absorbed that. The fleet hung motionless in the dark, 412 ships full of sleeping minds, full of the weight of everything they had done and everything they had been and everything they would now, inescapably, have to be instead. And us, Dara said. What do we do now? Sarah didn't answer immediately. She looked at the planet below, at the light still moving through its depths, slower now, the frantic intricacy of the readings settling into something more like the deep, patient rhythm of an entity returning to rest after great exertion. The archive, having done what it had spent decades preparing to do, breathing out. "We do what we've always done," Sarah said. She looked at the stars. "We wait," she said. "We learn. We remember." And then, quietly, so quietly that Dara almost missed it, she added the last thing. The thing that was not for Dara, not exactly, but for the dark beyond the viewport and the fleet suspended in it, and every species that had ever looked at humanity and seen only a thing to be broken. "And we make sure," Sarah said, "that the next ones know." The planet below pulsed once, slow, deep, vast, like a heart confirming it was still beating, like a library turning the last page, like something that had been waiting a very long time simply, finally, continuing to wait.